inspired from a basketball question I saw asked today on Twitter, and that is, how many different number one ranked teams will there be in college basketball? And I said, that's an interesting question to ask about football.
Because in basketball last year, there were a lot. And you know what the number is for football. So I don't know how many number one, this is AP number one teams that we're going off of.
And this is just in the regular season.
Yes.
Just in the regular season.
Yeah. So last year, Georgia was the number one team to start the year, were they not?
Yes.
And they lost in September against Alabama. And so then off to the races we went on a variety of number one teams. No, but then Oregon was so good. And they were undefeated. I'm going to guess we had 3 number one teams last year.
You will be off by 1.
Was it 4 or 2?
It was 4.
So it was Oregon, Georgia.
Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Oregon.
Well, that's right. Alabama was number one after they beat Georgia, and then they lost. And so the question is, how many will there be in 2025?
And by the way, that number
that's a low number, right? Or is that a high number?
That's the most since 2012.
Holy crap.
That is the most since 2012. 2012, USC, Bama, Oregon, and Notre Dame were all number one during the regular season.
So the first question you got to start with is, who's going to be number one in the preseason? Because then you either figure out if they'll lose, and if so, when will they lose? And they will lose, probably. We're not going to have an undefeated team. I think the preseason number one team is going to be Texas.
Okay.
And I think they could lose week 1, and thus we would then have a new number one team the very next week, because they're at Ohio State playing in the Horseshoe.
Yes.
So I decided to say a number of 4 because of that. Because, and so here's a couple of candidates for you. I think the winner of that game will be number one, at the very least for a week. But I was like, you know what? I bet Ohio State wins. Their schedule after that's very, very manageable. But then it gets a little tougher late in the year. Clemson was the team that I looked at. A lot of people like Clemson. And John, if you like Clemson, their schedule is very manageable. After LSU early, they have a lot of games that they could win before things get a little tougher in the back half of the schedule. So they were candidate. And then the usual candidates, a Penn State, of course, and Oregon, of course. Any of the SEC teams like the Georgias.
I think the catch here is going to be if we get a team that settles in and has an easier schedule. And I have a feeling if Penn State gets to that spot, that it'll be like cruise control, and they'll be there for the rest of the season, right? Because Penn State's back half of their schedule kind of
so they have Oregon
manageable, cakey.
They have Oregon in September, and they have Ohio State on November 1st.
Okay, so there's 1.
Yeah. So that they would, if they got it early, they'd be good. The issue is that I think that there are so many big games in other parts of the country early on. Clemson, LSU, that's going to be a data point. We already mentioned Ohio State, Texas. That's going to be a data point. Georgia plays Alabama in September. That is going to be another data point. And so like those games, I think the winners of them all are going to have a claim to be number one. And then you see what happens kind of around them. But I think you're right. We're on the same wavelength. We're looking for a team that has a schedule where they can get off to a nice little runway, and they're hanging out at number one for multiple weeks without really being challenged. But they also have to have an important win in their back pocket. You know, you can't just be undefeated. You're going to have a nice win in the early part of the schedule. So, yeah, I wrote 4, and that's wild that is.
And that's a high mark. That's why I think it's probably going to – I just have a feeling a team –
It's going to be smaller than that? It's going to be 3?
I think 3.
3?
I think 3, which is still, for recent memory, a higher number.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to, some of these schedules, the luck of the draw, and how tough this – Georgia's schedule, the SEC schedules are just the same thing. They're flipped. So that means Georgia's schedule, which was brutal last year, is again brutal. They have Ole Miss on the schedule. They have Alabama on the schedule. They have Texas on the schedule. They have all these teams on the schedule. You can say the same thing for a variety of SEC teams. The Big Ten isn't doing it that way. They're not doing home and home.
Now, if Texas gets past Ohio State, remember last year Texas's schedule was very manageable.
If Texas gets past Ohio State, then yes, they are a team.
Then they could run the table and stay there until the playoff.
Yeah. If they're an undefeated type team, because after Ohio State, they have Florida on October 4th. They have the Red River Shootout on the 11th. And then, John, they don't have Georgia until November 15th.
I think I'm going to bump it down. I'm going to go 2.
2? So that means you think Texas is going to beat Ohio State. If you think Texas is going to beat Ohio State, they will definitely be the number one team.
Yeah.
In my opinion, the number one team in the country for the preseason is whatever. The number one team going into week 2 is the winner of that game. And in my opinion, rightfully so.
Mhm.
There's no other week 1 game
No,
that is that big.
no.
The
that's
closest
true.
is Clemson and LSU, but LSU's not going to be ranked as high as those two teams are. I guess the only way I could be wrong is if somebody else is number 1 in the preseason and the voters just decide not to react as strongly as I think they will or should.
Mhm.
I think the winner of that game deserves to be number 1. Not knowing anything else about the rest of the teams in the country, especially if Texas goes into the shoe and wins in a road environment. I think they deserve to be number 1. And I think if Ohio State wins, they deserve to be number 1. Shane asks, how many number 1 changes were there in 2007? I don't have that in front of me, but I know it was a lot.
Let's see.
LSU was number 1 multiple times. I believe Ohio State was number 1 at least once. The crazier thing about 07 is that number 2 was actually the more cursed spot, where you had like weird teams like Boston College and South Florida, Missouri, and others. Those teams climbed up to number 2
Okay, 2007, USC.
in the preseason.
Yes.
Okay, so what's 1?
And they held on to it until week 5.
Because they lost to Oregon State.
Or LSU.
Okay.
They held on to it for 2 weeks. Then Ohio State.
Okay.
And then Ohio State held on to it for 3 weeks, then back to LSU.
Okay, so is that a 4th team or is that 3 teams still? How would you describe that? That's
Well,
just the third. It's the third team.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
It's a second time.
Yeah.
But then they lost it again because they lost to Arkansas. Though I guess that was like the last game of
And
the
then
season.
Missouri.
Missouri had it, so that's 4.
And then it went back to Ohio State after
going
the
into the bowl games.
After the conference championship. So there was 4, right?
4, yeah.
Ohio State, Missouri, LSU, and USC.
Interesting.
Since 2014, how many different schools have been number 1 in the country?
Since what year?
Since 2014, how many different schools have been number 1 in the regular season?
8.
It's 9. Name them.
Since what year? 14?
Since 2014.
Okay. Georgia, Alabama, LSU. Is that it in the SEC? I'm trying to think if I'm missing anybody in the SEC. Let me go to other conferences first. Michigan, Ohio State. Wait.
Ohio State, yes.
But Michigan never
no.
did. So we're at 4, and I need 5 more teams since 14. Oh, man. Florida State.
There's
Because
one.
they were
There's
undefeated. One. Clemson.
There's one.
I need 3 more teams. Oregon.
There's another one.
2 more teams. I don't think there's any other West Coast schools. Texas. Did I mention Texas?
There's no.
I'm missing 1 team.
You're missing 1 team. And if you don't get this right, how can anyone call you Mr. Football?
Is it?
Only a damn fool ringing a cowbell would call you Mr. Football.
I was going to say it's Mississippi State.
Mississippi State.
I was going to say it was one of the Mississippi schools because of 2014.
Correct.
Nick, in the first ever college football rankings, there were 3 SEC schools in the top 4. And if I remember right, 2 of them were from Mississippi.
It was Mississippi State, then Ole Miss.
Yeah.
You not knowing that right away, I think we need to start calling you Mr. Fartball.
No. Nobody should call me that,
Mr.
Nick.
Fartball. Get on the Canva, Nick.
No.
Get on the Canva, Mr. Fartball.
Damn it.